Well, we'll now stop at our third checkpoint and gather some tools needed for conducting a proper historical investigation. When historians employ method, they typically use arguments to the best explanation. This is where specific criteria are employed in order to compare hypotheses. And the hypothesis that best meets that criteria wins. Let me give you three of the most important criteria for weighing hypotheses. Explanatory scope. According to this criterion, the best explanation includes all of the relevant data. So imagine trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle like Winnie the Pooh here, and that each puzzle piece represents a historical fact. The best solution includes the most pieces. Explanatory power. According to this criterion, the best explanation accounts for all of the known facts without having to force any of them to fit and without leaving much ambiguity. The hypothesis that does this best is to be preferred. And you can see in this case, we do have some pieces that do fit, but you can tell they've been forced. That's what we're trying to avoid. Less ad hoc. Sometimes it appears as though historians are attempting to salvage their failing hypothesis by appealing to an explanation for which there is no independent evidence. And when this occurs, that hypothesis may be said to be ad hoc. So in this solution to the puzzle, not only are some pieces stranded while others are forced, but you can see that there's an outside solution here that makes the whole thing quite convoluted and torturous, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Now, these three criteria are very important, and while none is fail-safe, they serve as guides for historians. The more criteria that are solidly met by a hypothesis, the greater the probability it has of being accurate. So when may a hypothesis be said to be proved? Well, we may think of a staircase, and the higher we go, the more certainty we can have. Historians may firmly hold their hypothesis as correct when it is the best explanation and is far superior to its competitors. Now, I place a hypothesis meeting these conditions somewhere between quite probable and very probable. And in the literature I've read, I find that most historians will place it somewhere around this category, although they may give different terms here, and some even place it lower on the steps. Now, let's put our method together, our method to practice, and see how it works. This will be our fourth and final checkpoint. There are three facts pertaining to the resurrection of Jesus that are virtually undisputed and are granted by virtually all scholars who study the subject, including skeptical ones. Fact number one is Jesus' death by crucifixion. Fact number two, Jesus' original disciples believed that he rose from the dead and had appeared to them. In short, we'll call this the appearances to the disciples. Fact number three, Paul, the persecutor of the Christian church, converted to Christianity when he too had an experience that he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him. In short, we'll call this the appearance to Paul. Now let's apply our method and see how it works. Given time constraints, I can't possibly deal with all of the natural explanations proposed during the past 2,000 years, but I can deal with one that Professor Ehrman has defended. We'll call it the wishful thinking hypothesis. It states that after Jesus' death, his disciples turned to their scriptures in order to make sense of what had happened. They read passages like Psalm 16, 22, 69, Isaiah 52 and 53, and concluded that Jesus had been resurrected. With this knowledge, some of Jesus' disciples had visions of him. Now let's see how it holds up. This hypothesis accounts for Jesus' death by crucifixion nicely, since Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 describe situations remarkably similar to a crucifixion. So we'll give it a green light. However, it doesn't do so well in the second fact. Josephus in the first century reports that there were a number of proclaimed messiahs around the time of Jesus within a couple of centuries, and that in every instance the movement fell apart after the Romans executed the Messiah figure. Well, this shows that the same would have probably occurred with Jesus' followers had he remained dead. And even more importantly, of these biblical passages, only one may be interpreted to suggest bodily resurrection. That's Psalm 16:10, which in Greek says, "You will not allow your Holy One to undergo decay," or in Hebrew, to see the grave. The psalmist is not referring to post-mortem existence, but is stating his belief that everyone, or that God will rescue him in his immediate situation from being killed and buried. Now, since everyone would have known that God had not rescued Jesus from being killed and buried, it's a stretch to claim that the early Christians would have used this text. That is, unless their experiences had convinced them that the bodily raised Jesus had appeared before them. In other words, given Jesus' bodily resurrection, we can understand why the early Christians interpreted Psalm 16:10 as they did. However, it's doubtful that they would have come to this interpretation given a happy hunch or nice feeling that Jesus was alive and still among them in some sense. So the second fact gets a red light, since it possesses a bit of exegetical strain to the biblical texts and a bit of ambiguity in relation to the experiences of the disciples and Paul. So the wishful thinking hypothesis doesn't do well either with the third fact, since Paul was not a Christian at the time and would not have been trying to make sense of Jesus' death and the experiences of the disciples. For pre-Christian Paul, Jesus died the rightful death of a false prophet, and the disciples were either liars or psychotics. So it too gets a red light. So of the three facts, the wishful thinking hypothesis can only comfortably account for the first. So I would encourage those who think they see the light on this explanation to be careful. That light ahead isn't what you think. Now let's look at the resurrection hypothesis in comparison. It accounts for Jesus' death by crucifixion, the appearances to the disciples, and the appearance to Paul. And so, in other words, it explains all three facts without a bit of strain, and so it easily beats wishful thinking hypothesis in explanatory scope and power. Ad hoc criterion, the wishful thinking hypothesis is left having to postulate the sort of experience that convinced Jesus' disciples and Paul that he had been raised bodily and appeared to them. I'm not going to try to do this for Professor Ehrman, but I will say this: unless he can present a scenario that comfortably accounts for these and for which there is independent evidence and support, his hypothesis will lack even greater explanatory power or possess an ad hoc component. Resurrection hypothesis doesn't have to do this, and so it easily passes the less ad hoc criterion. Therefore, when we weight both hypotheses, the wishful thinking hypothesis is very light and loses to the resurrection hypothesis on every criterion. Historically speaking, the resurrection hypothesis is far superior, and I discovered that when we perform this exercise against other hypotheses, resurrection comes out on top every time. It's the best explanation of the historical facts and outdistances competitors by a significant margin. So, we've arrived at our destination, so let's debrief on our journey. We have taken a journey down history highway, and we visited 4 crucial checkpoints along the way in order to complete our journey successfully. We clarified some terminology at the first. At the second, we discovered that horizons pose a serious challenge that compromise their work of historians, and that no historian is exempt from this challenge. We laid down several speed bumps in order to slow us to a cautious pace in order that we may achieve some degree of objectivity. At the third checkpoint, we discussed method and identified 3 tools or criteria for weighing hypotheses. When a hypothesis fulfills the 3 criteria and beats competing hypotheses hands down, the historian is warranted in holding firmly to that hypothesis as representing what actually occurred. At the 4th checkpoint, we applied method. We discussed 3 relevant facts that make up the historical bedrock pertaining to the fate of Jesus. We then weighed the wishful thinking hypothesis against the resurrection hypothesis and found that the resurrection hypothesis wins by a significant margin. So, can historians prove that Jesus rose from the dead? Since it's the best explanation of the known facts and beats others by a significant margin, as historians, we may say that it's quite probable to very probable that Jesus rose from the dead. Enough confidence to hold our conclusion firmly. Stated in more popular terms, yes, historians can prove that Jesus rose from the dead. Thank you.